So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on Zoom and on Facebook and also in person. A couple of students are here. Uh, my name is Fadl Kaboub and I teach in the economics department. And it's my pleasure to um, do this webinar on 10 years after the financial crisis, 10 years after the crash. This is the second in a series of webinars that we're doing with Denison Connecting. Last semester we did a session on climate stress in the Middle East, kind of a session on climate change and political conflict in the region. Today we're doing, sort of the 10-year assessment of the financial crisis and the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I think we have one more date. I don't remember the date.
April 4th.
April 4th at 7 p.m. Also, we're doing the third installment, which will be a panel of alumni, Denison alumni in the finance industry. And I'll be joining that panel as well. So without any further ado, thank you for being here. And what I wanted to do today is to assess, how we're doing 10 years after the financial crisis. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion about the root causes of the financial crisis. Who's to blame? Is it, homeowners who borrowed too much money and couldn't afford those homes? Subprime borrowers? Is it commercial banks that were engaged in some sort of predatory lending? Is it investment banks that were innovating too much and sort of creating all of these new derivatives and taking excessive risk? Was it credit rating agencies, Moody's and Fitch and S&P, sort of misleading investors by rating a lot of these financial products, mortgage-backed securities and other derivatives, rating them AAA and misleading investors? Some people blamed AIG, obviously was a big player in this, especially in terms of the credit default swaps that they were engaged in. Was it the Fed lowering interest rate too much in the early 2000s and then not reacting quickly enough in 2006, 2007 when there was a clear sign that the market was moving into a crisis period? Was it the Fed, was it Greenspan who didn't really pay attention to shadow banking, not pay attention to mortgage-backed securities and all the excessive leveraging that was taking place? Was it Congress? Was it the deregulation of the financial system? More specifically, the gradual removal of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 and ultimately the passage of the Banking Modernization Act of 1999, the Commodities and Futures Modernization Act of 2000, massive deregulation in the financial system that allowed for a lot of this excessive risk-taking, excessive leveraging, and also lack of careful supervision. So there's some of that. Was it just bad apples? A couple of a handful of bad players in the market that sort of created the crisis? There's a little bit of truth in each one of those, and I can spend a day on each one of those to assess exactly the role played by each one of these key players and beyond. But there's also this idea that this was a perfect storm in a way that each one of these agents or players contributed to this perfect storm of a disaster that happened in 2007, 2008. But there's one thing that's frequently and often ignored in this whole discussion, and this is really what I want to focus my attention on, is that there is something much more systematic, much more structural that has emerged since the 1970s, 1980s in particular, and is still with us today. And with every financial crisis that we've experienced since then, we sort of brush it, under the rug and sort of ignore it completely. And I think this is what we've done since 2008 as well, which tells me that the next financial crisis will have similar root causes, and as a result, we should be looking at some of these structural issues. And without any further ado, this is it. This is what I want to argue, that it's structural inequality that is at the root cause of this financial instability, and I think will continue to be the main source of instability for the U.S. economy moving forward. And I'll have quite a few slides to elaborate on this with some data and with some more specifics. So hear me out. Let's look at some numbers. This is this data here shows productivity and hourly compensation, so real wages adjusted to inflation, starting in the 1950s all the way to recent time. And you can see that wages and productivity are sort of rising hand in hand all the way until the mid-70s, early 70s, mid-70s. And then something strange starts to happen. Wages go flat pretty much, and productivity continues to rise. And as a result, the gains from productivity are now not going to the average consumer, not going to the working class, the middle class, but it's pretty much going to the upper income groups. And we've heard a lot about inequality and the source of inequality, reasons behind inequality. But this here is just the first piece of the puzzle that I want to lay out today to illustrate why this is extremely destabilizing for the US economy. The second piece of the puzzle is recognizing that consumer spending in the United States, not in other economies, consumer spending in the United States represents 70% of GDP, roughly 70% of GDP. So it's the main engine of economic growth. It's the main engine of economic activity. So in this case, you would think that when workers, the middle class, the working class, they lose a significant amount of kind of increases in income, you would think that the level of consumption for the working class and middle class would stop, would stagnate as well. But it didn't. It continued at the pace of 70% of GDP, and it continued to fuel economic growth all the way to until now. So where did the money come from? How can people afford, the working class, the middle class, how can they afford keeping up that consumerism, consumer spending at the tune of 70% of GDP if their income is not increasing? And the answer is simply access to credit. So consumer debt is the flip side of this picture. So a little bit more on the indicators illustrating rising inequality. This is the Gini indicator, the Gini index. Again, very clear picture of rising inequality. This is real average family income growth by quintile for families in the U.S. From the 1980s to the recent, leading up to the financial crisis. You can clearly see that the top income groups have gained a disproportionate increase in real income compared to the lower quintiles, the bottom 20%, essentially no increase in real income. So this is another way of looking at the inequality picture and highlighting that in order for these groups, sort of the bottom half of the income groups, in order for them to continue spending at the tune of 70% of GDP and to fuel consumer spending, that source of income has to come, that source of spending has to come from access to credit. So access to credit comes in a variety of forms, and you can think of standard consumer loans, you can think of credit cards, mortgage loans, home equity loans, home equity lines of credit. You hear people saying they're using their house as an ATM machine. This is what we're talking about. Subprime loans is the more recent wave. Ninja loans. Ninja is not my phrase. This is the actual name of these loans, which stands for no income, no job, no assets, and yet you're able to get a loan. This is what happened in the lead up to the subprime crisis. Reverse mortgages, which is something that's happening increasingly in the last 10 years, targeting primarily senior citizens. Death bonds. This is sort of derivatives that instead of packaging mortgages into mortgage-backed securities, here you're packaging life insurance policies into these derivatives that are labeled death bonds. I can go through the description of each one of those. If people are interested online, I can I can go into specifics. But my point here is that there's a wide variety of what I would call financial innovations that essentially extend additional sources of credit to consumers year after year after year. And every time we hit a sort of a limit on one of these, there's a new thing that hits the markets and allows consumers to continue to spend beyond their regular income. So every time some of these forms of access to credit are introduced, they're never introduced and sort of hit the market and become a dominant source of access to credit. A lot of these sources, for example, the credit card industry. Credit cards existed for a long time before it became accessible to the middle class, to the working class. And it always takes changes in regulation, an act of Congress, or in some cases, the Supreme Court, in the case of credit card industry, the Marquette decision of the Supreme Court that allowed credit card companies to issue credit at higher interest rates. And that's why you see a lot of, after the Marquette decision, a lot of credit card companies moved from New York and other places to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because South Dakota was the first state to remove the upper limit on its usury laws. And the Supreme Court decision allowed credit card companies to charge the interest rate of the state in which the credit decision is made. So if the loan officer, so to speak, is sitting in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and reading an application for a credit card from a customer in New York or California or Ohio, and and approving the credit, then the interest rate of South Dakota applies to that customer. And that's what really gave rise to the credit card industry as a major source of access to credit, starting in 1980, 85, 86. And then again, deregulation from Congress, sort of allowing homeowners to deduct interest points for home equity loans and home equity lines of credit, that sort of fuels this. The subprime loans, again, getting rid of the Glass-Steagall Act regulations, such as, having to have a minimum of 20% for a down payment and having to have very rigorous credit history check before issuing loans. All of those things were gradually removed, and sort of it became open season for this sort of subprime and ninja loans to take off. So there's always innovation, financial innovation, introducing a new kind of financial product, and it always comes with changes in regulation that allow for that particular product to thrive and to take over. And it's one after the other, sort of always leading to additional access to credit for consumers. So this is what it leads to. This is household debt as a percentage of disposable income. So this starts in the 1950s all the way to the lead up to the financial crisis. And you can see the peak here. The highest level, I think, is 137%. This is in 2007, 2008. What this means is that if you take this as an average family, and the average family doesn't make $100,000, but let's say they make $100,000 a year, this is saying that at the peak here, that family that makes $100,000, their debt is $137,000. Which is way beyond anything we've experienced in the past. Most people will tell you the reasonable level for debt to disposable income would be something around 60-70%. So this is pretty much where we were in the 60s and 70s. This is the reasonable level. But then things start to accelerate, actually exactly in 1985. This is the birth of the credit card industry, not as a technology, not as an instrument, but in terms of its dominance after the Marquette decision, the Supreme Court decision, credit card companies moving to South Dakota. And then every step of the way, starting 1985 all the way to 2007, 2008, you see this continuous increase in consumer debt as a percentage of their disposable income. And it looks like there's no stopping it. But then when it does stop, when consumers have no access to credit, and when consumers slow down spending, remember consumer spending is 70% of GDP. So that immediately hits economic growth. But in this case, obviously, it was also accompanied by a massive financial crisis. So this is not a sustainable way of driving economic growth. And the thing is, when we hit the crisis and we try to sort of clean up the mess of this financial crisis, the immediate discussion that you hear from policymakers, from Congress, from professional economists is the following: how can we get banks to lend again? How can we get consumers to borrow again so that we can fuel economic growth? Because that's 70% of economic growth. Nobody's asking the question, how can we reduce household debt? Or how can we increase household income so that they can spend out of pocket as opposed to spend through borrowing? And that's the tricky question that we need to address at some point. So essentially what we've done after 2007, 2008 is restart the same engine of consumer debt, the same engine of consumer spending, and the same engine that feeds into this instability, so that in the next financial crisis, I don't know, we're going to be at 150, 160% household debt to income ratio, and then the crash is going to be even more painful than the previous one. So it's time to have a conversation about how do we reduce the level of debt and at the same time allow consumers to spend proportionally. And the only answer for this is really addressing the root cause, which is inequality, the stagnant income for the middle class, for working class. But it's a question of redistribution. And that's the most difficult political question that that this country faces. And given the political divide, it's not clear that it's going to be resolved anytime soon, but it needs to be addressed. So this data here is for the average family. But if you start to break down families by income group, then you start seeing even more extreme levels. So here what we have, the darker line here on top, is the poorest income group in the United States. And at the peak here in 2007, the debt to income ratio was almost hitting 270%. And at the same time, the wealthiest 10% of the population, their debt to income ratio is right around 70%, which is the stable level that most people tell you it's a reasonable level. So when you break it down by income group, you start seeing also the effects of this debt problem, consumer debt problem, household debt problem. As a result, we've seen significant unemployment in 2008 through 2010, but then the official unemployment rate started to decline all the way to we're right around 4% right now. So it sounds like, you know, we've fully recovered. And this is what you hear in the media most of the time, that unemployment is at 4%. Most people in the media already say we are at full employment. And that's it. We're done. We should be celebrating. But it turns out that there's quite a bit of hidden unemployment and hidden issues that go beyond these official statistics. So the better indicator to look into is things like this: long-term unemployment as a percentage of overall unemployment. So long-term unemployment, these are people who are unemployed for more than 27 weeks. And once you're unemployed for more than 27 weeks, you know, the perception in the job market by employers is that you become unemployable. So long-term unemployment is a significant problem. So when you look at this, Excel did something crazy with my axes here. When you look at this, you realize that we really haven't seen anything like the 2008 crisis in any of the previous recessions. This is going back to the 1948. The closest we can get to this would be the Great Depression. So this is really what makes this recession, the last 10 years, a significant problem. So here, the numbers, this should be 50%, right? So we're talking about 45% of the unemployed at the peak here for long-term unemployment. And that's, we haven't seen anything like this since the Great Depression. The underemployment rate, so this is sort of a more rigorous way of looking at the true side of unemployment. So underemployment, it's not the same term that we use in colloquial conversations. In colloquial conversations, when you hear somebody saying, I'm underemployed, they mean I have a PhD in physics and I'm working at McDonald's. So that's what in everyday conversations we mean by underemployment. But in economics, the official term underemployment, it means those who are officially unemployed, like the official statistics for unemployment, plus those who are working part-time, not by choice, but for economic reasons, because they just couldn't find a full-time job. Plus those who were discouraged workers, those who looked and looked and looked for a long time and then essentially gave up looking because they've applied to every single job in the area, they've done job interviews, they've done everything they could possibly do, and they couldn't find anything, so they kind of stopped looking. So this is sort of the more reasonable way of looking at the real side of unemployment by including those categories. And there are so many additional categories that are not included here. But just adding those who are involuntary part-time workers and those who are discouraged workers, all of a sudden you see a completely different picture. So today, the underemployment rate is at 8%, whereas the official unemployment rate is at 4%. So every time you look at this side of the picture, you realize that the official unemployment rate is hiding at least half the numbers, right? So underemployment is almost always double the official unemployment rate. So that changes the picture. If we saw the headlines today that the unemployment rate is 8% as opposed to 4%, that the public perception and the policy action will be very, very different than what we're seeing today. And this is so this is the official unemployment rate by state. Those of you in different parts of the country can see how your home state fared in terms of official unemployment. So the darker the colors, the higher the unemployment rate. I'm going to let this run a couple of times just to give you a little bit of an idea of the beginning of the effect on unemployment, and it gets really dark in the 2010, and then sort of the recovery. The recovery is not equally strong in different states. So this is the official unemployment rate, not the underemployment rate. The next slide looks at youth unemployment. Again, the red is the highest unemployment rate, youth unemployment rate. This is something that very few people pay attention to. This is sort of the lost generation. People who were out of work for a long time in their prime age, and people who maybe didn't finish college because they couldn't afford it. And so this adds a different dimension to the so-called recovery. The next picture I have here, and I have to thank my colleagues at UMKC for helping with the GIS mapping for some of this. This is looking at unemployment by race. So you can see also the color-coded picture. On the right-hand side, the black unemployment. On the left-hand side, white unemployment. You don't even see red on the left-hand side. Red is orange and red are the highest unemployment rates. So we can start digging, and this is just a sample of kind of how careful we need to be looking at these things when we say, oh, the recovery is great, and celebrate and think and sort of fool ourselves into thinking that the economy is strong when the structural deficiencies and structural weaknesses are still with us today and will be the seeds of the next financial instability. Now, this picture is, this data is by a colleague of mine, Pavlina Cherneva, who produced this chart in, I think, 2011, 2012, I believe, and it's been updated since then. And this is showing the recovery, the benefits from the recovery. So this is distribution of average income growth during expansions. So in the history of the United States, the recent 50, 60 years, every time we hit a recession and then we go through a recovery, there's new growth, there's new wealth that's created, and this shows who gets most of the wealth. So if you go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, every single recession we've hit, the recovery, the benefits of the recovery, the blue lines, goes to the bottom 90% of the population. Whereas the top 10% of the population, or the red bars here, they get a little bit of the benefits from the recovery. But then you start moving into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2008 recession, and you start seeing the benefit, most of the benefits of the recovery, the vast majority of the benefits going to the top 10%. And the bottom 90% of the population essentially getting nothing in the 2001 to 2007 period. And it's actually negative in the last recovery. So the bottom 90% is actually losing ground in terms of benefiting from the so-called recovery. So this slide by itself should be a huge warning sign for us to think about what we're doing to the U.S. economy, what we're doing to the middle class, the working class, that group that drives GDP growth at the tune of 70% of GDP is not getting anything. And as a result, if we are going to continue to be a consumer-driven economy, we have to fix this. This is unsustainable. We can't continue to count on consumers accumulating massive amounts of debt without having any sort of readjustment. So I'll give you, before closing, I'll give you just a quick example. So we're in Lincoln County here in Ohio, and this is data from MIT. The MIT Geography Department has this fantastic database. It's called if you just Google the Living Wage Calculator, MIT, you'll get a database that has living wage data and cost of living data for every single county in the country. So I just went digging and looked for Lincoln County, and what you find, especially for people working minimum wage jobs, the minimum wage is just not even close to what would be a living wage that will compensate for basic cost of living, especially for families with kids. And I'll let you look at the slides and look at the data more carefully. The next slide shows the cost of living in Lincoln County. And again, it's by family size, families with one parent working, two parents working, with one kid, two kids, three kids. And you can see that the cost of living is substantially higher than what a full-time minimum wage job would do. So the first step in kind of undoing this structural deficiency is raising the minimum wage, moving to a living wage situation. We sort of forgot the point of having a minimum wage was so that full-time working people can afford a decent quality of life and minimal basic level of being able to pay for rent and food and transportation and childcare. And you notice here that childcare is a significant portion of this budget, family budget. So my point here is that I worry about the next financial crisis. The next financial crisis is not going to be the same subprime loans. It's not going to be the same sort of financial instrument. It's going to be a new kind of innovation, financial innovation. And there's going to be lots of leveraging, and there's going to be quite a bit of deregulation that will sort of let the system loose on a particular item. And it's always going to be driven by getting consumers to borrow, getting companies to borrow beyond reasonable limits, excessive leveraging, and then we hit a wall, and that's when the deleveraging happens. So the good news, we should have some good news, is that after 2008 there was Dodd-Frank is a significant piece of regulation. It's not perfect, but it has significant contributions to monitoring the financial system. And I'm not going to go through every single piece of Dodd-Frank, but I'll highlight a couple of things that are important, that should be strengthened, and should be given additional resources to monitor the financial system. So one of the things that frequently happens in the financial system is that you have different agencies regulating different segments of the financial system, and certain things fall through the cracks. So you have the SEC, you have the Fed, you have the control of the currency. All of these agencies are important, but the creation of the so-called shadow banking system managed to fall in between the cracks and sort of escape regulation. And as a result, escape supervision. And that's one of the reasons why the crisis, to some extent, was a big surprise to regulators, because they didn't see it coming, because they weren't looking. So Dodd-Frank created something called FSOC. FSOC is the acronym, which stands for Financial Stability Oversight Council. FSOC, Financial Stability Oversight Council. And the role of this council is to meet at least once every 3 months and bring in all the major regulation agencies and make sure that, number one, they're talking to each other, number two, that they're looking at the system as a whole, as opposed to just, kind of having a tunnel vision in their own jurisdiction, and trying to figure out what is missing from the supervision lens that needs to be addressed. And this group has sort of a research unit that's being essentially asked to do extensive data gathering and research, to sort of act as a radar detector for financial instability. So that's a major achievement. At least it allows us to know what's going on, to look at different segments of the financial system that have escaped supervision, and to be able to sort of intervene as the crisis happens, not way after the fact when it's too late to do any kind of meaningful intervention. The second piece that's also very important from Dodd-Frank is the creation of CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is tasked essentially by protecting consumers from things like predatory lending. And predatory lending is a serious problem, especially in the most vulnerable communities that suffer from high levels of unemployment in particular. This semester, my monetary theory class is doing, as a class, they're doing research with the local community organization on predatory lending here in Ohio, here in Licking County. And when we started looking at the national trends and at the local issues in Ohio and in Licking County, it's unbelievable the amount of abuse that you see. So we're thinking of, I'm talking about payday lending stores and rent-to-own places and buy here, pay here type of lending schemes and used car loan schemes. All of these sort of agencies are essentially providing access to credit to individuals who can't make ends meet. And this is why I put these slides here. When you have a situation where the minimum wage is not sufficient for people to make ends meet at the end of the month, people going paycheck to paycheck. If a car breaks down, if somebody gets sick, if any kind of spending emergency happens, individuals have no savings, no access to credit. The traditional banking system doesn't lend to the so-called underbanked or unbanked. Some people don't even have bank accounts or access to the traditional banking system. They fall prey to these lending schemes that are excessively expensive. And if you can't make the payment after 2 weeks, the fees start to kick in and the interest rate goes up even higher and higher. And people get trapped into these vicious cycles that are just unsustainable. So this is really and when we talk about the unbanked and underbanked population, I'm talking about 28% of the population in the US. That's a significant portion of the population that doesn't have access to traditional banking services at reasonable interest rates if they needed to borrow. And that's the percentage of the population that doesn't have the source of income to make ends meet and ends up in these sort of predatory lending schemes. That's a major source of instability. And it's sort of moving up from people working minimum wage jobs to even middle class groups because of the inequality issues that I highlighted. So the good news, we have some agencies that are tasked with this, but at the same time, if you follow the news in recent months and recent weeks in Congress, there's also attempts to weaken those agencies, especially CFPB. And that's just not good news, because if we weaken the agency that's designed to address predatory lending and excessive fees and abuse for borrowers, then it's just a recipe for continuing this vicious cycle. And if we weaken FSOC, which is this radar detector for financial instability, then we're weakening our ability to detect the next financial crisis. But ultimately, as I said from the beginning, I believe that this structural inequality is here with us for the next financial crisis. I don't see anything being done to address it systematically, and I worry that this will be a major source of instability going forward. And with that, I'll take questions and comments from people on Zoom or Facebook.
So Facebook's winning. They've sent 4 questions.
Okay.
So everyone watching on Zoom, make sure you're sending your questions in. So our first question was, how does student debt fit in? There's debt, but nothing's really bought with it. So
There's debt, but sure. So student debt is yet another, one of those access to credit things I forgot to add to my list, and it's significant. It's $1.4 trillion worth of debt. We've never seen anything like that in the history of the United States, or in the history of any country, as a matter of fact. So when you think of that very first set of pictures that I showed here, the inequality thing, I'll go back to it here so we can talk about it a little bit more. If you, I'm not sure the age group of the person asking, but when I talk to my students about this, I say, think of your parents' generation, people who went to college, before this gap started to materialize. How did they pay for college? They have to get student loans that they have to get, and you realize that during this time period, if you go to a state school, a community college, education is essentially free and affordable, right? And that's no longer the case. So you start looking at a whole bunch of sort of benefits that have been lost over the years for the working class and the middle class that now have to be financed through access to credit. And student loans is just one of those. Car loans, student loans, consumer loans, mortgage loans, subprime loans, reverse mortgages.
62.
Oh, there you go. So it's probably, his generation, right? Anybody from that generation probably going to college in the U.S. and during that time period would be able to go to a major state school and receive fellowships and grants and all kinds of financial support, and not have to graduate with, $100,000, $200,000. I mean, we're not talking about people also going to medical school, people going to law school. It's just not reasonable to straddle young people who are entering their professional life with this kind of debt, when they could be looking to buy a house, looking for a house to buy, to start a business, to build their future, and to be an active participant in the economy in a much more significant way. They go through the first 10 to 15 years of their lives sort of paying student loans, and it's a huge contributor to this rising inequality as well, because it becomes a question of privilege of who can afford it.
Sure. So we have lots of questions coming in. So if you're asking, please know we'll get to them, I promise.
Okay.
So the next question was, I'm going to kind of keep them in order that I'm getting them. So minimum wage was never expected to be a living wage. Isn't this a false assumption?
The minimum wage was introduced as a basic living wage. It wasn't meant to be a poverty wage. The idea was, if you're working 40 hours a week full time, you should be able to afford certain things. You shouldn't be expected to rely on assistance from the government to have food stamps and to have other sort of assistance. I mean, this is, if you go back, long enough in history, you realize that people on minimum wage did not have to live extreme sort of poverty type of conditions. But over the years, we forgot about adjusting the minimum wage. And if you look at the history of when minimum wages were increased, it's, you look at 10 to 15 year gaps sometimes between one increase and the other. So we've lost so much ground over the years that just going back to the level of the 1960s, we'll have to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, at least. In some cities and some states, it will have to be much higher than that. And some cities are already doing this. States are already doing this. Even companies are recognizing this. Walmart increased its sort of own internal minimum wage, not because it was forced to, but because it recognized that if you increase wages for your employees, people making that basic entry-level type of wage, where are they going to spend the additional income, the extra $100 a month or the extra $150 a month? Pretty much most of it is going to be spent buying stuff from Walmart. So it's not, Walmart gave bonuses also to its employees and recently. Where did they spend most of their bonuses? At Walmart. So large employers are beginning to recognize that this is unsustainable too, because you do need consumers to spend. And they can't spend if they don't have income. They can't spend if they don't have access to credit. But access to credit should be reasonable, within reason, not the kind that we're experiencing right now.
So that ties into another question that came in. I'm going a little out of order now. But
okay.
The question was, if people made more money, what would keep them from continuing to live beyond their means?
So there is room for financial literacy. There's room for sort of thinking about consumerism, consumer culture that we have in the U.S. beyond any other country. And those of you who are interested in the concept of sustainability, just the kind of consumerism that we have in the United States, if the rest of the planet tried to match the level of consumerism, well, we're doomed, right? So that's something that has to be addressed, right? So questioning the fact that 70% of U.S. GDP is consumer spending is a reasonable thing to question as well, right? But if we're going to remain as a consumer society, as mostly driven by consumer spending, the model has to change. And if we're going to think about a sustainable, path to economic growth, we have to think of a different way of consuming. Reducing consumption and shifting economic activity to different areas of the economy. Services that provide more care for communities as opposed to producing more stuff. And if we had another hour, I'll come back and I'll do my pitch for what I think should be done to address inequality, to address unemployment. So that would be something like, those of you who are familiar with this concept, it would be sort of a Green New Deal type of program. So job creation that restructures the economy around green infrastructure and shifts consumer culture and consumer spending away from consumerism into providing services that improve quality of life. And there's plenty of work to be done, but somehow most policymakers think that we can't afford it unless we produce something and sell it and generate some sort of income. I think that whole model needs to change. And as I said, I'll be happy to come back for a full hour and elaborate on that side of my research. But it's a very good question. The whole economic growth model is in and of itself unsustainable.
And then another question from Facebook, and then we'll move over to our Zoom participants who are sending lots of questions.
Okay.
Will minimum wage increase, if we increase it, I'm kind of trying to read this question. Will minimum wage increase layoffs, unemployment, government welfare?
Good question. So this is a common sort of argument that you hear a lot of people saying. So this is where my macroeconomic thinking kicks in. So if you're thinking about the minimum wage from an individual employer perspective, let's say you have a small restaurant and you have 5 employees, and then the government says the minimum wage is higher, so you have to pay them more. Now, everything else equal, your cost of doing business is higher, your revenues are the same, so you're losing money, right? You could go out of business if you think of it from an individual perspective, an individual employer perspective. But you have to remember that the minimum wage is not applied to just one business. It applies to everyone. So then you have the entire working class essentially earning a little bit more per month. And the working class, especially people working minimum wage jobs, they spend all of their income. They essentially don't save anything. So they're going to spend it across the board, and Walmart and Amazon and across the whole industry. And as a result, sales will go up, revenues at the macro level will go up, and as a result, profits as well will go up. And this is what we call the paradox of wages, or the paradox of profits. But if you think about it from one company's perspective, it's a bad deal to increase the minimum wage. If you think of it structurally from a macro perspective, the higher the income for the bottom ladder, essentially, of the pay scale, the higher revenues you'll receive, because those consumers will spend all of their newly earned income, and that goes directly to employers. There will still be some companies that fail and some restaurants that fail, but restaurants fail anyway sometimes, not because of the minimum wage, because of all kinds of other conditions. So we have to be careful about the macro structural effects and not sort of think of this from a very narrow perspective that implies that every increase in wages will automatically lead to a failure of a business. And case in point, I just mentioned Walmart. Walmart by itself, without anybody forcing it, and it turned out to be pretty good PR for Walmart anyway, increased wages and experienced an increase in revenues as well, because their own workers spent more at Walmart, the new wages that they receive. And there's been a lot of studies about this. So we have to have a very careful look at the impact of increasing the minimum wage.
Okay, lots of questions.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
so predatory lending is only a factor when there's no alternative for borrowers to meet emergencies. What is needed to eliminate predatory lenders? Is some other way for them to get the resources they need? Absent predatory lending, those borrowers would really implode faster.
Right. And that's true. I mean, this is the argument that you hear from payday lending places. They say, we're here to help, right? There's nobody offering any kind of emergency assistance, kind of short-term loans to people who can't make ends meet and face a health emergency, or a car breaks down, or some sort of emergency. And that's a conversation that we need to have at the national level. That what kind of system do we have that allows people working full-time, to not be able to make ends meet, not to be able to manage a mini crisis, a mini emergency. And most payday loans, by the way, are not, people borrowing thousands of dollars. Most payday loans are, $300 to $400 to fix the brakes when they go bad in the car, to fix tires, or to take a kid to urgent care or something like that. So that's why I go back to the importance of raising the minimum wage, the importance of creating good paying jobs that allow people to accumulate some basic level of savings to be able to face emergencies. So that's one side of the story. The other side is to address the 29% of the population that I described as unbanked or underbanked. So unbanked population, these are people who don't even have access to a bank account, traditional banking. So you end up, if I hire somebody to mow the lawn and I pay them, $30 with a check, and they don't have a bank account, how are they going to cash the check? They're going to go to one of those, check cashing places that will charge them $7 or $8 fee to cash their own check. That's unreasonable. That's a huge percentage of their paycheck that's going to, banking fees, just because they don't have access to a traditional bank account. So we need to address this, the big banks in every single community. We need to figure out a way for either the traditional banks to offer cash checking services at reasonable fees, or checking accounts with no fees for working people, or think of different models. There's a postal banking model. Lots of countries around the world, the post office itself operates as a basic banking services agency, so that people can cash a check or can wire money to a family member. So there's lots of different ways that we can provide basic banking services at very, very low cost. If the private sector is unable to do it or not interested in doing it, there has to be some other way of doing it at the city level, at the state level, at the national level, through the post office. There's lots of models around the world. That still doesn't address the emergency loans. And that's where the problem is. If you don't have access to a bank and you don't have any credit history, you're not going to have any kind of background financial track record to apply for a regular loan, a consumer loan, or some sort of loans at reasonable interest rates. So we need to be able to first give people access to the traditional reasonable banking services at acceptable rates and acceptable fees, so that people have the opportunity to have some sort of emergency loan and access to credit if they don't have the traditional resources that the middle class and the wealthier individuals in this country have. And it's really, the focus is on the emergency, because payday lending is an immediate loan. You get cash on the spot, which is not the way it works in the traditional banking. You apply and you wait for a week and they email you, you come back for an interview and sign here, initial here, sign. It takes, by that time, if the car broke down and you can't get to the workplace, you've already lost your job by the second week of the application process, and you're not going to be able to afford the loan anyway. So there has to be some new kind of reasonable access to credit that's designated for those kinds of purposes, in addition to addressing the minimum wage and addressing basic financial services. So we're so far behind in terms of addressing these things, but there's so many bits and pieces of the puzzle that need to be fixed at the same time.
Okay. So for the student debt piece, going back to that, would you suggest that this kind of lending not be available to potential students?
To stop student loans? Well, if we eliminate student loans, then we're eliminated access to education for a whole bunch of people. And if that's the choice that the country wants, that's a very bad choice. The last thing you want is to scale back on education and skills, and but we need to think of a different model of access to higher education to produce the skills that will continue to drive the economy forward going into the future. There's a recent study, by recent I mean the last 10 days, I think. If you go to the Levy Economics Institute website, levy.org, levy.org, there's a recent major report done by Stephanie Kelton, Scott Fulweiler, and a couple of other colleagues, essentially trying to estimate what would be the impact of canceling the entire student debt, the impact on the economy. And their conclusion, I mean, it's a lengthy, detailed report. I invite everybody to look at it carefully. But essentially, it's going to be a significant boost for consumer spending, shifting payments from student loans and interest and fees to spending on building up resources to put a down payment on a house, or to start a business, or to pay down some other kinds of debt, credit card debt. It's actually a significant boost for the economy overall. But obviously that's going to be a big political decision that has to be made as a country. Are we willing to do that for an entire generation and move forward with a new model of funding college education? If we have, if we as a society put a significant value on education and skills as a major resource for the future, then we need to figure out a way of making it affordable and accessible and not burdensome on the next generation. So I invite everybody to take a look at that Levy report on student debt.
Okay, so a question that's from one of our alums from the class of '93, who's also a small business owner. She'll be expanding her business within the year, and she hears a lot of pushback from various parties on the news with regard to the increase in the minimum wage. The concern is that businesses cannot stay viable if they have to pay higher wages. What is your response to that? And how do I explain to others how higher wages benefits everyone? How long after wage increases do you think it will be before prices on services and products increase?
Right, absolutely. That's a very good question. So there's another piece of the puzzle other than the minimum wage that we need to take into account. The way we think of taxation in the United States and beyond is that we think of tax revenues as a source of funding at the federal level, as a source of funding other government programs. So for example, every employee and every employer is taxed 7.2% for the employee and for the employer in order to fund Social Security and unemployment insurance and all kinds of things. But if we think, and that's, to me, the purpose of taxation at the federal level is not to fund things, but the purpose of taxation is to really give the currency its value. Otherwise, it's completely worthless. It's fiat money. It's not based on gold or anything. So and this what I'm addressing here, some people in the audience are probably familiar with MMT, modern money theory. If we accept that concept of taxation, then we recognize that if the purpose of taxation is not to raise revenues at the federal level to spend, then we can think of the tax on employees and the tax on employers as a bad tax. Because why should we punish employees for working? And why should we punish employers for hiring people, right? So we can think of taxation as taxing pollution, taxing gambling, taxing alcohol, taxing, speculative behavior, taxing predatory lending. These are the kinds of taxes that we need to push more aggressively. But taxing employers for hiring workers to work at minimum wage, that's bad policy. Taxing employees for working, for contributing to the economy, it's also bad policy. So if it was up to me, I would compensate for the increases in minimum wage by reducing taxes, especially on small businesses. As I said earlier, the example of Walmart is sort of different than a small business because of the scale of the company. But for small businesses, there has to be a different kind of relief. So giving higher wages is important for the working class, for the middle class, but relieving small businesses from taxation is extremely important. Very good question. I'm glad somebody asked.
So does increased productivity not keep prices low?
So in the case of the U.S., if you look at the years here, notice that starting in the 1980s, 90s, and moving into 2000s, there's something else that also happened. There's quite a bit of the globalization movement that is happening. Quite a bit of the outsourcing is happening. So that the fact that Walmart prices remain low and accessible is not due to increases in productivity in the U.S., but it's the cost savings of relocating all the manufacturing, the assembly line type of jobs to cheaper labor countries. So that brings in the whole concept of globalization into this. But the fact that prices remain low in the U.S. is not necessarily due to the fact that wages stayed low.
And then how does the price of college compare to the rate of inflation?
So when you look at the cost of college, and this is not really my area of expertise, so I'm going to be sort of going off of memory here. When you look at the things that drive most of the costs for higher education, it's insurance, health insurance for employees is a significant thing. So that opens up a whole other discussion about healthcare, the healthcare industry in the U.S. and the cost of health insurance. It's a significant cost. When you think also of U.S. universities, especially the kind of the smaller, more competitive private colleges, quality of life on those colleges has improved dramatically from the generation that went to Denison in the 50s and 60s to our students who are enjoying all the new buildings and the swimming pool and all of those things. And we're kind of reasonable at Denison in terms of these things, but if you look at some of the universities around the country, the swimming pools and the water fountains and the water slides, and it's like Disneyland in college, which is completely unnecessary. When you think of the larger schools that have the big basketball teams and the big football teams, I think in most states the highest paid state employee is the football coach, right? Followed by the assistant coach, followed by the basketball coach and things of that nature. So those are real costs, right? So yeah, it does bring donations from alums and ticket sales and endorsements and things of that nature. So there's that whole side of higher education that's kind of moving away from what used to be the traditional kind of college experience into a much higher standard of living, beyond what is reasonable in some cases. In addition to the cost of running facilities that are much more energy intensive, much more sophisticated in terms of operations, but the cost of the health cost is a significant component. So I'll just leave it at that.
We have a few more questions. So for the Licking County cost of living, the numbers seem very unrealistic.
Oh.
Daily food allowance is $8.24 per day. Healthcare costs $700 per month in reality. Yet the allowance on the chart is $196 per month. Monthly rent is around $500. Could you expound on how these numbers were derived? And thank you.
Oh, thank you. So as I said earlier, this is from the MIT cost of living database. I've used this slide several times in the last couple of years in presentations here in Licking County with people who pay rent in Licking County and go through these expenses in Licking County. And believe it or not, they say these are beyond reasonable numbers. They're actually surprised at how well the data reflects their experiences, especially for rent and childcare. And I invite people to look at their own communities, their own hometown, their own county, and see if these numbers add up. But thank you for the comment. I see it as very reasonable based on what I see in the community, based on people who live in Licking County and think of these as their standard expenses.
So another question, and hi Cole, remember Cole from the first session?
Hi Cole.
So it appears that the current administration and Congress are not on the same page as you. Assuming
I agree.
Assuming the next financial crisis will occur relatively soon, what do you think their response will be, particularly versus their response to the 2008 crisis?
Yeah, they're definitely not thinking the same way that I'm thinking. And this is really not the current administration only. This also applies to the Obama administration, because the Obama administration really was the administration that dealt with the aftermath of the financial crisis, essentially the entire 8 years of President Obama's presidency. And that's not him personally, it's the entire set of policymakers, Congress, the Democrats and Republicans. As I said earlier, as soon as the crisis hit, and the dominant narrative that you hear in policy circles in Congress and the Senate, President, is how do we get banks to lend again? How do we get consumers to borrow and spend again? And there's a lot of blame in 2009, 2010, 2011, lots of pressure from policymakers, from the Fed, sort of begging banks to go back to lending, saying, look, we bailed you out, we fixed the system for you. Now it's your turn to go back and lend to consumers so that they can revive the economy. So it's always the same model. How do we restart the same borrowing engine, the same consumer debt engine? It's not about changing the engine, changing the structure of the economy. So I wouldn't put the blame just on the current administration. The blame on the current administration is trying to weaken CFPB, consumer protection, is trying to weaken FSOC, this financial sort of radar detector. that's really the threat, is for bad things to happen without adequate supervision and quick intervention. But I'll reiterate my conclusion that that engine of consumer debt is still in place. It's still the main engine of economic growth. And when we hit the limit, consumers will stop having access to credit, and that's going to start a snowball effect, a downward spiral, similar to the 2008 crisis, similar to prior financial crisis, by the way. But my fear is that this time is going to be even more damaging because we're going at much higher levels of debt. So the stakes are bigger. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for the question.
So another question on Facebook. If we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, what happens when goods and services pricing increase to pay for the new wages? Does the 15-hour wage now become an unlivable wage?
Right, so I'll go back to my Walmart example. Walmart did not increase its prices when they increased wages, right? So there's no automatic relationship between increasing wages and increasing prices, because we have to go back to the root of the problem. I mean, the whole thing about inequality. Let me go back to this picture. Let's see. So if we think of what we're doing by raising the minimum wage, it's a redistribution thing, right? So there's a couple of things that can happen. You can raise the minimum wage, and then companies like Walmart decide, you know what, we're going to increase prices to compensate for it, which they didn't do, by the way, this time. Or you can raise the minimum wage, and as a result, not increase prices, but instead reduce, shareholders, wealth. So it's a question of redistribution. It doesn't have to lead automatically to inflation, and we've seen it again with the case of Walmart and other companies and other cities and states that increased their minimum wage. It didn't lead to inflation spirals in those states. So we have to be willing to kind of rethink this huge gap that we've experienced since the 70s, because it's decades of worth of catching up. And we're not saying, we need to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour tomorrow. It has to be gradual, consistent, but we need to get there pretty quickly. We can't continue at this pace because this is a structural deficiency. Are we better off when we have these kinds of financial crises just because we fear inflation? Let's remember that inflation has really been in check, because after the financial crisis, we've been in a sort of risk of deflation. If you look at the Fed, the ECB, the European Central Bank, all major central banks around the world, after 2008 until very, very recently, their goal was to push inflation up to 2%, sort of the safety zone, so that we don't go into deflation. Deflation is much more dangerous than inflation. Deflation is what we experienced in the Great Depression. It's a downward spiral for the entire economy. So since 2008, most central banks have been trying everything they can to push inflation up to 2%, and they failed miserably. Inflation is not an easy thing to achieve, and raising the minimum wage by itself is not necessarily going to do it. We have to realize that the U.S. economy, if you compare the U.S. economy type of inflation versus, say, what some people say Zimbabwe or Venezuela, the kind of spirals of inflation that go out of hand, we have to realize that the U.S. economy has significant amount of excess productive capacity, so that when there's additional demand for goods and services, we have plenty of capacity to crank up the machinery and kind of meet that new demand. But countries like Zimbabwe, the reason why they experienced hyperinflation is because there was a significant fall, about 50% fall, in agricultural production because of a political decision to reallocate land to people who are not farmers for political reasons. So supply of food dropped by 50%, but demand was still the same. So what do you expect to happen to prices? Prices go up. And as a result, the government decides, you know what? We need to compensate our soldiers and military officers and and government bureaucrats, we have to pay them a little bit more so that they can afford the higher prices. And that's when they started printing money. But the real cause is not the printing of the money. The real cause is a drop in food production. Same thing in Venezuela when they lost oil revenues. They have this structural deficiency because they don't have enough productive capacity to meet the demand. But in the US, we're way beyond that. We have plenty of productive capacity to meet any additional, reasonable additional level of demand without causing inflation or hyperinflation. And case in point, you look at all the forecasts for inflation for the US economy, long-term forecasts by all major industries, including by financial markets. So these are people sort of voting with their dollars and betting on inflation rates going forward. We don't see any inflation anytime soon. So we have to reconsider our fear of inflation and refocus the conversation on reasonable things to do in order to restructure, redistribute the level of income in a way that produces an economy that grows in a sustainable way and that grows without this risk of financial instability that I described today.
So do you think that the government drives more of the economy or the free market?
It's an interesting question. So when you think of the US economy, the size of the government in terms of GDP is relatively small. I mean, and it's not new. I mean, it's been consistent with the exception of World War II, the intervention during major wars. The size of the US government is 15, 16, 17% of GDP. It kind of goes up and down a little bit, but it's around 15 to 16% of GDP. So we're definitely not government dominated. We don't have governments owning companies and industries and things of that nature. So it's definitely a market-driven economy, but a market-driven economy it operates in a legal framework. I mean, when we think of contracts, these are legal agreements that have to be enforced in a legal framework, and it has to be enforced in courts. So that's why we have a legal system. That's why we have regulations, and that's a significant role for the government, especially in the financial industry. When you think of financial innovation is not like innovation in engineering when you have people in the lab and kind of doing physics experiments. Financial innovation is essentially taking a financial instrument, which is technically a legal contract, and modifying the terms of that particular contract and turn it into a new type of instrument. And that's what derivatives are. Financial derivatives are instruments, financial instruments are derived from other financial instruments. All of this operates in a legal framework. So the role of government is extremely important in regulating and creating the right kinds of incentives for the private sector, and in intervening through its spending and taxing capacity at the federal level especially, to counter the effects of fluctuations in the private sector. So the private sector is driven by expectations about the future. So you'll find companies only investing and expanding if they believe, if they expect that there will be additional demand for their products or services in the future. So that decision is very psychological, and the mass psychology of the market goes through waves of optimism and pessimism. And when we go through a wave of optimism, everybody's optimistic about the future, so they hire, they expand, consumers have more income, they spend and go through that positive spiral. But when we go through a negative wave of sort of pessimism, a wave of pessimism, psychological pessimism, collectively in the private sector, businesses will naturally not take the risk and expand. If anything, they'll reduce their risk taking, they'll reduce their spending. And in a similar way, banks will also do the same. Banks will reduce their lending. And if we have less lending, less spending, less hiring, we start the vicious cycle of a recession. And that's really the point where the government needs to intervene by having its spending weight essentially counter that negative wave of pessimism by building infrastructure and investing in things that matter for the rest of the economy, and investing in pockets, different geographic pockets also of the economy, where there is need for investment and resources. And this is how we address the different pockets of poverty and inequality around the country. So the blanket spending across the board does have, benefits, but it's not as beneficial as the well-targeted spending that the federal government needs to be doing. So to answer your question, yes, we're primarily a market-driven economy, but a market-driven economy left to its own devices will constantly go through these cycles of growth and recessions, and growth and crises. And that's when the government intervenes. So the role of the government is to regulate as much as possible as the economy is going to prevent speculative bubbles and excessive risk-taking and abuse, and sort of intervene with its spending weight during bad economic times to counter the business cycle, as opposed to own companies and dominate and own and control. So we're not talking about ownership and control, we're talking about managing the business cycle and targeting particular areas of spending to address issues that matter for the system as a whole.
Okay, some more questions came in. If you were to advise the current administration on where to lower the debt, which areas of reduction in government spending have the greatest positive impact on the economy?
So just to clarify here, this question is about government debt or not consumer debt. If you could read it again. The way I'm reading it, the way I'm hearing it, I think the person asking the question is thinking the government debt.
So they wrote, if you were to advise the current administration on where to lower the debt, which areas of reduction in government spending have the greatest positive impact on the economy?
Okay, so if I'm reading it, I'm hearing it correctly, the person asking is asking about the national debt, the $20 trillion. Well, where should I start? those who understand MMT here are kind of waiting for this. The biggest problem that we have in the US economy is not the federal government debt. The biggest problem we have is consumer debt, the private sector debt, corporate debt, household debt, and also debt at the state and city and municipality level.
Clarified, yes.
Government debt, okay, well, that's how I read it. So here's the thing. The $20 trillion, when you think about it, and Alan Greenspan was asked about this back in the day when he was chairman of the Fed. He was testifying before Congress, and there was a pretty aggressive series of comments from congressmen and senators, kind of deficit hawk saying, don't you think we should pay off the national debt? We're going broke, it's a burden on future generations. And Alan Greenspan said, if you pay off the national debt, you might as well shut down the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank. By which he meant, if you pay off the national debt, you're essentially eliminating all of those government bonds that the Fed uses on a daily basis to stabilize interest rates, stabilize bond markets, to stabilize financial markets, and to stabilize inflation, by the way. So it's a major policy tool. About close to 50% of the national debt, what we call the national debt, is owned by the Fed. What is the Fed? It's a government agency. Who's the boss of the Fed? The Fed, at the end of each year, the Fed makes about $120-some billion in profits. Where does that money go? They don't distribute it to shareholders. They don't give it to their employees. They give it to their boss, which is the IRS, the Treasury. So we have to rethink the way we usually think of this national debt. Because in reality, a sovereign government like the federal government, the US government, doesn't really need to borrow its own money from its own people. So the national debt at the federal level is very different than my personal debt or a corporate debt or the debt of a local state or municipality, because all of us are users of the currency, users of the US dollar, whereas the federal government is the issuer of the US dollar. And by definition, users and issuers operate in a completely different space when it comes to public finance, when it comes to finances. So you and I have to work hard, earn an income in order to be able to spend. We can also borrow up to a certain limit if my bank allows me to borrow up to a certain limit. But then we have to work hard, earn more income, and or reduce our spending in order to be able to pay our bills, to pay our debt. Same thing for the state of Ohio, the state of New York, all of these, local state government agencies, they have to operate based on the principles of sound finance. Work hard, earn tax revenues or income to pay your bills. And if you borrow, work harder to pay it off. The federal government is the issuer of the currency. So without the federal government issuing money into existence, into circulation, into the economy, we wouldn't have any money to use. We wouldn't have any money to borrow and spend. So it has to be a net issuer of money for the rest of us to be able to accumulate savings. So when the government borrows, quote unquote, the federal government borrows from us, the federal government is selling these bonds that I can buy and kind of postpone my consumption for 20 or 30 years until I cash my bond plus interest payments. So think of the federal government selling bonds as a less coercive way of taking cash out of circulation. And that's one way to sort of tame inflation, by allowing me as a consumer to save money in a sort of savings account, right, that we call government bonds, and postponing my consumption, as a result, reducing demand and reducing pressure on prices in the current period. And that's one way to think about taming inflation. In addition to that, it's allowing the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank of the US, to have this extremely useful policy tool, buying and selling government bonds on a daily basis, not to speculate, not to make money. They happen to make money in the process, but the goal of the Fed is not to speculate in the bond market. The reason the Fed is intervening on a daily basis is to be able to manage and stabilize the rest of the economy, stabilize short-term interest rates, stabilize the level of liquidity in the system. So once you start to think about it from this perspective, you realize that what we normally call the national debt, this $20 trillion, think of it as the national savings account, that big clock that we have in New York City that keeps ticking, $20 trillion that everybody's panicking about. We should change the label, called the national savings account, and everybody will celebrate that the national savings account is increasing. So I invite you to look into this kind of literature, modern monetary theory, or MMT, and I'll be happy to come back and do a whole session on MMT. Or you can just Google my name and look it up on YouTube, and you'll find plenty of videos by myself and other people in this field. But MMT allows you a new lens of thinking of the purpose of government spending at the federal level, the purpose of taxation, and it completely shifts the discussion away from the national debt is too high and we're going broke, into focusing on the debt that I was talking about today, which is consumer debt. So that's kind of my very brief attempt of trying to get us started on understanding MMT, which is a very difficult thing to explain in a few minutes. But I'll be more than happy to engage beyond this session, because I know there are other questions.
Yeah. So another question that came in was, what about a two-tiered minimum wage? High school kids are getting initial employment experience and are not trying to live on the wage. The minimum wage is increased significantly. Do employers consider replacing workers with technology, like kiosks in fast food restaurants?
Right. So that's a very important question in terms of, there's this argument that, the only people who work minimum wage jobs in fast food places are just, high school kids who are just, making a little bit of extra money and getting a little bit of basic work experience. It's true. There is quite a bit of, younger kids entering the job market and entering the minimum wage pay scale. But if you look at the numbers, and I'm sorry I don't have the exact numbers with me here, the vast majority of people who earn minimum wage, especially in the fast food industry, are actually, adults, parents. Some are single parents, some are married couples. So it's beyond the high school, temporary experience. This raises the question of what kind of work experience do we want to provide for high school kids who are entering the job market. Yes, there's lots of skills to learn from working in a fast food place, from working in a warehouse, from working construction jobs. But we have to think of kind of transitional employment programs, think of apprenticeship programs, think of job training programs that address the imbalance that we also have in the U.S. economy, many other economies. The idea that everybody needs to go to college, and we're kind of forgetting about the vocational and vocational type of training is another deficiency that we have in the labor market in the U.S. and so many other economies, to be honest. So it's a very good point, but we have to consider that most people working minimum wage jobs are not high school kids. But we do need to think of upgrading the transition from school to work for younger people in a way that gives experience, gives income, maybe shifting away from the hourly wage into an internship that pays a scholarship or pays, compensates younger people for housing costs in the summer or, living costs in the summer. But more driven towards jobs training and scholarship as opposed to just a basic income to supplement, in some cases, supplement the family's lacking income, because quite a few younger kids are actually supplementing the family's income by working part-time. And if that's the case, then it needs to be a higher minimum wage also for high school kids if they're complementing their family's income and participating in the family's budget. So that needs to be looked at very carefully, but it's a very important point.
So to wrap up, because it's almost 8:30, but we have a couple of comments on Facebook and then comments within Zoom to kind of go back to the cost of college. So, people saying that their children might have the same college standard of living as they did, and not really thinking that you can attribute the 20 times increase to an increased standard of living, and other people commenting that, as much of the increase in college costs, it can be connected with the availability of government support programs, think of Pell Grants and student loan availability. Look what happened to healthcare costs when Medicare and other health insurance programs started paying those costs. If individuals had to pay them themselves, the medical providers would not be able to charge such high fees. So I think maybe because that was such a popular,
absolutely, yeah.
On a comment around that.
The scaling back of government support for higher education in general as an industry, but also for the students going into universities is also a significant contributor to the rising cost of higher education. What I want to close with, maybe if this is the last question, and I'll try my best to go back, especially on Facebook. If there are other questions, I can go back later and answer them on Facebook in
There's
writing.
someone, and there's one that just came in that doesn't really tie in with this. So let's end on this, and then we can answer this one by text.
All right. So one thing to consider in terms of the cost of education, and it's really not, this goes beyond higher education. This goes also into high school and middle school and K through 12 type of education. Just to help us refocus our priorities as a nation at the macro level. Would we rather, as individuals, would we rather have us as a society contribute to funding after-school programs, music lessons and sports programs and summer camps, and college education as well, at a higher rate than what we're doing right now? Or would we rather not do that and allow middle school and high school kids not to have after-school programs, not to have sports and music and theater and all the things that open up so many possibilities and horizons for young kids, and allow them to go into the kinds of things that we've experienced, which is, go into trouble, drug abuse and high school dropouts and teenage pregnancies. All of these things don't happen by accident. They happen because there is a scaling back of all the intervention that a lot of schools and after-school programs used to have. Would we rather do that and then pay for the consequences by, providing this school-to-prison pipeline and having to deal with issues of recidivism and spending our money building prisons and funding police and courts and that kind of stuff, instead of addressing the root cause of a lot of those issues from the beginning by adequately funding schools and after-school programs and summer programs and training programs and transition to work programs. So we don't have to spend the money on the worst end of the spectrum, but spend money the right way from the beginning. Same thing with higher education. Would we rather invest in producing the right kinds of skills, higher learning skills, engineering and medicine and legal and math and science and physics and humanities and the arts, so that we produce a younger generation, a new workforce that enters the workforce with new ideas for starting businesses, for starting organizations, for contributing, without having to worry about spending the next 15 years of their lives paying massive bills on the student debt. I think that the choice should be pretty obvious at the national level, that we need to rethink our priorities. So I'll leave it at that in terms of education.
Yeah, there's one more question that came in. I don't know if you want to answer it. Or we can answer it by text, but okay. Just want to put it out there. With China having a lot of the USA's debt, I understand MMT's idea that the Fed can pay off all of it, but why wouldn't that cause massive inflation, and wouldn't China have the power to cripple the dollar that way?
Classic question. Thank you.
So let's answer this one, and then...
Yeah, I'll answer this one.
Yeah.
So, yes, China does have a significant amount of government bonds, but we have to realize if we were having this conversation, say in the 1980s, the question would have been Japan, not China, right? But we have to recognize that China is the second largest economy in the world, and it's a major trading partner for the US, in the same way that Japan was also the second largest economy in the world in the 1980s and a major trading partner. So it's no surprise that they do a lot of business in US dollars and interact and save and accumulate resources in US financial instruments, the safest of which happens to be AAA rated government bonds. So that's the number one point to keep in mind. The idea that China would decide in a sort of decide to hurt the US economy by selling all of its government bonds at once and causing a major damage to the US economy, it's just not a reasonable argument, even when you think about it from China's perspective. Why would you decide to hurt your number one trading partner and lose a lot of business as a result of that? It's just not China's wealth, its savings is accumulated primarily in US dollars, although it's shifting a little bit to other financial instruments. But why would you decide to kind of shoot yourself in the foot? It's just not a reasonable thing that the Chinese central bank will decide to do that. The question of inflation, if the U.S. pays off the entire national debt, nobody argued we should pay off the entire national debt. Yes, we're saying that when bonds come due, when they come to maturity, the government, the Treasury, can always issue currency and pay it. But at the same time, the Treasury is also selling brand new bonds. So it's a natural thing for the national debt to continue to expand as the economy expands. What matters from the federal government perspective is not how high the level of the national debt is, because it's not a personal debt. It's not the same as my personal debt. When my personal debt goes into higher limits, I have to worry about it because I have to work harder and pay it off. But if I'm the issuer of the currency, why do I have to worry about being able to meet the debt payments when they come due? Because you always issue the currency to make those payments. What you need to worry about as the Treasury, as the federal government, is stabilizing inflation, stabilizing prices, addressing issues of unemployment, inequality, addressing issues of financial stability, which relates to inequality, as I illustrated today, addressing climate change, which is a major area where the federal government does have the firepower, so to speak, to do what's necessary to move us faster into more sustainable, renewable energy system. I'll close maybe with one example just to illustrate this whole thing about MMT and the national debt. Think about the Great Depression, the worst time in recent U.S. history. terms of economic situation. We thought the U.S. economy was broke. There was no money in the system, mass unemployment, poverty, starvation, misery. We thought we didn't have the resources. We thought we didn't have the money. All of a sudden, we go from the worst economic time in 1942, between 42 and 43, into mass, production for the war effort, into full employment without causing inflation. Granted, there were mechanisms put in place to prevent inflation. Those mechanisms, by the way, increased the national debt without causing inflation. There was mechanisms put in place to shift the U.S. economy from essentially zero production, close to zero GDP, to full capacity and beyond full capacity. That didn't cause the U.S. economy to go broke. That didn't cause hyperinflation. It just shifted the economy into full gear, full speed. Where did the money come from? We didn't tax anybody during the Great Depression to say we need tax revenues in order to pay for the war effort. There was nothing to be taxed to begin with. So it wasn't tax revenues that all of a sudden allowed the U.S. economy to thrive and win the war and beyond. So we have to think of our situation today, which is much, much better than the Great Depression, and say, let's use the full potential that the sovereign government has and win the next war. The next big war is the war on climate change, is the war on inequality, on poverty, on all of these structural issues that are much, much easier to achieve than what was done in the 30s and 40s. And we have tools in place, and MMT is very helpful in this way to allow us to describe the mechanisms that we can use to prevent inflation, to prevent that breakdown in the economic system, in the same way that's been used time and time again, typically in times of war. We manage to find the spending without having to cause inflation. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll invite people to do a little bit of reading and research and reach out to me if you have any questions by email or in any other way, and I'll be happy to elaborate or come back for another session on MMT, modern monetary theory. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for joining us, and we're scheduled for April 4th at 7 p.m. for a panel with I think 3 or 4 Denison alums from different generations, different classes, to talk about
how they've leveraged their liberal arts degree
right.
to get into the field of finance, and they're all in kind of different aspects of finance as well.
Right.
So we're hoping that we'll get some current students to come to that one as well.
Absolutely, we'll get
bring your
a few more
friends.
students.
Yeah.
Okay.
But thank you so much, and we're going to be in Charlotte next. So if any of you listening are in Charlotte, March the 8th, come to our event.
Okay.
All right. Thanks
Thank you.
all.